Hey dudes, today we're talking about one of my favorite sets of all time, Arabian Nights. Arabian Nights is super interesting for so many reasons. So let's jump right in. Arabian Nights was the first ever expansion set, and it's quite a bit different from most other expansions. Magic ended up being significantly more popular than anticipated, and they sold out of alpha pretty much instantly, and limited edition beta also moved very quickly. So, Peter Adkinson asked Richard Garfield to bust out a set as quickly as possible. There were plans for sets before Alpha even released, with Ice Age and Mirage, called Menagerie at the time, already in development around 1992. But these sets were not even close to being ready, so the Ice Age team put together Antiquities pretty quickly, and Richard threw together Arabian Nights in like a couple of months. Arabian Nights is unique to Magic sets, at least it was at the time, because it used an outside intellectual property, that being the classic collection of stories, often called 1001 Nights. Richard Garfield's reasoning for using this source material was that it would be easier to make cards based on pre existing lore than it would be to make up a story and a bunch of cards. That makes sense to me, so he quickly read through the stories, and every card in the set was based on these stories. Well, that's not entirely true. It was all of them but one. City in a Bottle was actually based on the comic called The Sandman, issue number 50, titled Ramadan, a comic book that inspired Richard to use the Arabian Nights theme. We will talk about this card in a bit, but we have a lot to get through, so let's move on. Like I said, this set was made insanely quickly and was almost exclusively top-down design, meaning that the cards were designed around flavor and mechanics were made to fit the story of the cards rather than the mechanical needs of the game. The set also received almost no playtesting, and its entire development cycle was a handful of emails between Richard and Scaphalias and Joel Mick. As there wasn't much time and everyone involved basically just read the cards and made assumptions from there are some interesting quirks about this set. Scaff actually talks about the development a little bit in an article that Wizards lost when swapping servers, but according to the Wayback Machine and his recollection, the only real concerns with the set were Library of Alexandria and Ruck Egg, of all things. Apparently, Library of Alexandria was even more insanely good, and he talked Richard into nerfing it. The funniest part about the article is they talk about raising the mana cost of Ruck Egg, but never talk about the ambiguity of its original wording. As the card reads, if it hits your graveyard from anywhere, you get a 4/4 flyer for free. This is in the same set as Bazaar of Baghdad. This was corrected pretty quickly, assuming you knew what the rule summaries were and were in contact with Wizards, but they didn't make a new version of the card until ninth edition. So for a lot of the players, that's just how the card functioned. This set is so fucking full of cracked cards, it's crazy. But I wouldn't really call many of the cards broken. Library of Alexandria, as mentioned, was absolutely insane at the time, and Bazaar of Baghdad is, of course, now cracked in fucking half, but at the time it kind of sucked, unless you were playing Ruck Egg as written, I guess. But still, there are so many incredibly cool cards in this set that are pretty strong. Flying Man is pretty gas. Old Man of the Sea is really interesting and even saw tournament play. El Hajjaj is a fun card for casuals. Erg Raiders was genuinely terrifying at the time. Guardian Beast is so fucking interesting, and Oubliette still sees play in Commander, and maybe it still sees play in Pauper. I know it was a strong card there for a while. Ape was also really strong for a while. Cyclone is really interesting. Drop of Honey might be one of the most underrated cards of all time, based on my anecdotal evidence. Aladdin's Ring looks terrible, but it actually does have some uses if you're creative. Brassman was a powerhouse at the time. Dancing Scimitar was a really good rate for the time. Pyramids might be the funniest fucking card of all time. Jeweled Bird is like one of two anti cards that is actually worth playing for any reason, and Ring of Maroof was way ahead of its time. City of Brass is also an awesome card, and Elephant Graveyard is also super fucking funny. This set is so packed, full of interesting and fun ideas. I haven't even mentioned the Little Dingus Merchant Ship, which is a card that sucks but brings me great joy. I also haven't mentioned the elephants in the room, and I'm not talking about War Elephant, but if you want banding and trample, that's your boy. The Jins and Afrits in this set are very cool and iconic as fuck. Serendib Afrit was a fucking beast. Juzam Jin is one of the most iconic cards of all time. Yidwin Afrit is usually underrated in my experience, and Urnam Jin mixed with Armageddon is a great play experience that probably everyone enjoys. And you can stop all of those little fuckers with King Suleiman, a card I absolutely love because of how busted and useless this card is. It's so funny. You see someone play this and you either laugh or you cry, depending on your deck. That's so fucking magical to me. I don't want to talk about every fucking card here because this is supposed to be a brief, but I do need to mention Scheherazade. Look at this fucking thing. If you've somehow never heard of this card, give this bad boy a read, but make sure you're sitting down. Talk about the most magical card in the game. Cards like this are why I love these early sets the most. This thing is fucking awful to play with and against for most people, and it's a card that spits in the face of tournament play, but I've always loved how fucking cool this shit is. Oh yeah, and if you do ever find yourself in a situation where you can play this card, my advice is to treat it as an aggro burn style card. Don't play this in a control list. Play this shit by like turn 3 with a fast and low to the ground deck, and you're going to have more success with it. I love this card so fucking much. What a fucking game. This set is not just interesting because of the powerful and unique cards, but there is also interesting history on the development of this set. Many Magic the Gathering players have heard the legend of the Arabian Night pink backs. But in my experience, most people don't really understand the context, so pull up a chair. The reason I see stated most often is that they didn't have the idea for a set symbol at the time, and they were worried about people knowing where their cards came from. This is true, but it's missing some context. The issue wasn't so much a collector concern, but what I like to call a pro-consumer move. See, Magic was the first ever living card game, and this was before society had come to terms with what that meant. Most of the experience Magic could turn to at the time came from the board gaming communities, and so Arabian Nights was seen like a board game expansion, more than anything else. And at the time, tournament play and stuff like that wasn't really a big consideration, especially since most of the early adopters were like D&D nerds. Competitive concern did come shortly after. Like, the game did very quickly develop this, but it wasn't a huge deal for Richard at the time that these decisions were being made. What did concern Richard is that he wanted expansions to be an opt-in process. He didn't want players to have to chase after cards to remain competitive, and he wanted a surefire way to allow players to opt out of an expansion. And while there are obviously real and legitimate concerns with doing different card backs in your variant game, while you're watching your opponent shuffling or shuffling their deck, you will definitely notice that they have expansion cards, and you can say, no thank you, I don't want some other IP in my Magic, I don't want to play with you. I'm not trying to say that I think going this route would have been correct, but I do think people are way too harsh on this idea. Anyway, Richard was talked out of it, and a compromise they came up with was the set symbol, which is pretty cool. Back to City in a Bottle, a pretty strong card in Eternal formats. The same logic was used to create the first ever expansion hoser, or a card that says you can't play with Arabian Nights cards. Once again, Richard wanted players to have control over their experience and how they played the game, and so he came up with City in a Bottle. Personally, I love this card, and I think it's hilarious, but it was a U1, or what we'd consider a rare, and you would have to opt into the experience by chasing this down or opening up a lot of product, which wasn't really an option with how much Arabian Nights was made, to be able to opt out of the experience. which maybe was not his most successful idea, but I still think this card is fucking sick. What else? What else? Oh yeah, let's talk about the light and the dark cards and the lone basic mountain that appeared in Arabian Nights. So originally, basic lands were on the Arabian Nights sheets, and this was a decision made so that a player wouldn't really be able to tell if you drew a land or a spell, since the cards were supposed to have different backs at this point. This decision was reversed because they decided it was lame and not cool to open basic lands. Or at least the decision would have been reversed. But unfortunately, Dave Howell had already done the color separation files, so there were basic lands in the set. Except that there was an issue in the 11th hour. The entire uncommon sheet and every quadrant of the basic sheet other than one failed in the color separation process. The only successful files were this part of the common sheet and the pink backs that ended up not being used. Taking a long story and making it short, the colorless mana symbol was the problem, so it was hastily remade and then the files were able to be rendered properly. So if you see a card that has the generic mana symbol that looks like any other set, it came off of one quadrant of the common sheet. And that's also why a lone basic mountain made it into the set, as this fuck up was happening while Dave Howell learned that they didn't want the basic lands anymore. So the basic lands were taken out of every other quadrant that had to be redone, but the basic mountain managed to stay in. There was another issue that popped up with the remade mana symbol, but I don't really have the technical background to understand what the issue was. As far as I understand it, the mana symbols received more black ink than they were supposed to, or something like that, which is why they look darker and are kind of harder to see. Anyway, Arabian Nights is one of the most interesting and fascinating sets in the game's history, in my opinion, and I really love this set for so many reasons. It's also really fucking fun to play a limited of, but it was definitely not designed for that, and while I would not call it competitively balanced, it is a fucking hell of a good time, in my opinion. Oh yeah, I should talk about Bird Maiden. Look at this perfect little dingus. This card was power crept before it was even made. Weaker than a card from Alpha, but I play this thing a lot. Flying is really good, and this thing is solid and limited and has won me so many fucking games in Chandelar. This card is one of my favorite cards in the whole fucking game. Just fucking look at this thing, dudes. Hell yeah. Anyway, that's all I can think of to talk about in this video, and I'm really hoping it is under 15 minutes, but I guess it is what it is. Thank you so much for watching. You can like the video if you liked it. You could also subscribe if you give a shit, but either way, I hope you have a magical day. Thank you for watching.